both Beethoven and Shostakovich, they were both afflicted. Beethoven because of his deafness, Shostakovich because of the oppression. Both had to survive in their own way, and both did. And what is remarkable about Shostakovich, always when one thinks that, how could someone with this creativity emerge in a society that was truly oppressive, truly dictatorial, who somehow by a miracle lived to see the world as it went until 1975, when he passed away, rather than perishing as millions did in the Gulag in the mid-30s. Yeah? And the question is, how was it possible? And the only answer that I know is that precisely because of the oppression, he had to find a way to express the life as he lived it, as all of his people lived. And he found that way where somehow it became acceptable to both the regime and the people. And that is a pure genius. When we think the operas he composed, the chamber music he composed, the songs he composed, the concertos, 2 violin concertos, 2 piano concertos, 2 cello concertos, 15 symphonies. And those are not little symphonies that last maybe 7.5 minutes. No, you're talking about a lot of the time, 60, 70, 75 minutes. Okay, sometimes it will be 48, but these are, how shall I say, he was not a sprinter. He was a marathoner, running a marathon in his compositional, in the way in which he would compose. And so, in that sense, there is hardly any genre in classical music that he hasn't touched. He also loved jazz. He loved folk music. Everything that was absolutely natural for him. And he had a way of expressing it. Interestingly enough, when he was still studying in the conservatory, he was extremely poor. All of them were. He was hungry. All of them were. He had to somehow find a way to make a little money. He was playing piano in the silent cinemas. And he was looking at the screen and he was just improvising things. No wonder later on in life he was asked to write film music, and some of it is absolutely great. He composed Lady Macbeth of Mtsensk, one of the greatest operatic masterpieces of our time, or all times for that matter. It had phenomenal success. I don't recall now how many performances it received in the very first year of its existence, this opera, not only in Leningrad where it was premiered, but worldwide. It's absolutely colossal. It's very hard to believe that something like that could happen. But once one comes in contact with this creation, one understands why. And it was that got him into a very deep trouble with Stalin and with the regime. He was touring as a pianist. That morning he was sitting at a train station waiting for his train, having a cup of tea, opened Pravda and saw the article which absolutely destroyed him. I don't know if Stalin himself had written it or gave it to one of his journalistic characters to write, but it doesn't actually matter. It would have never appeared had Stalin not sanctioned it. He attended performance at the Bolshoi Theater. He left in the middle of the performance. He was absolutely horrified by what he heard, by the subject and by the sounds. At that time, that meant essentially a death sentence. People were disappearing in hundreds of thousands without ever being heard from again. Shostakovich was a perfect candidate for that after that kind of denunciation. At that moment, his Fourth Symphony was already rehearsed to be premiered by the Leningrad Philharmonic Orchestra. One morning he came, he took the parts and left. The performance didn't happen. Because knowing the Fourth Symphony as we do today, it's very easy to understand that that would be in his mind, it would have been the final nail in the coffin. A little time went by and he came out with the Fifth Symphony, where he even said that this is the creative answer to a justified criticism. And it was a phenomenal event in the history of music with the ovation that lasted 1 hour. Mravinsky conducted it, Leningrad Philharmonic performed it. And what happened from that point on, this is how Shostakovich found his way of addressing the condition of his people and at the same time making the regime very pleased because they heard what they wanted to hear and people heard what it was about. The reason for the ovation was that. And from there on, Shostakovich continued to go in this way, the kind of musical language that he would be employing, but he never deviated from this line of, I would say, speaking the truth. And of course, then came the war. He started his Seventh Symphony, called Leningrad Symphony, even before the war began. He composed 2 more movements during that summer. So he had first, second, and third. And he had 2 very close friends, his closest friends. One was director of the Leningrad Philharmonic Society, Ivan Solertinsky. The other person was Isaac Glickman. So when the war started and Shostakovich invited these 2 friends to his apartment in the month of August 1941 because he wanted to play 3 movements on the piano for them. So they went, he started playing. At that moment there were sirens announcing bombing raid. He interrupted himself. He said, just a moment, I want to take my family down into the cellar. He did, he came back and kept playing. As it was during the summer, the nights are still what one calls white nights, the bridges open up. And by the time they left him, it was too late for them to cross the bridge to go to the other side where they were living. And Glickman describes what they were talking about. He and Solertinsky, having just left Shostakovich, having heard the first 3 movements of the Seventh Symphony, what they were saying to each other is that what they heard is what they were living at the moment. It was their life right there that they heard from him playing it on the piano. During those years in the 60s, came a poster announcing a premiere of his 14th Symphony that Rudolf Barshai with his Moscow Chamber Orchestra brought to Leningrad. And we see the 14th Symphony. We had no idea what it was. We could see that there were 2 soloists. Then we could see that the names of the poets whose poetry was used in the symphony, most of it was very much out of the politically acceptable, if you will. I went, I still have the program from that performance. I managed to preserve it. And while listening to it, it was obvious that he wrote a requiem to himself. Some years go by, comes another poster announcing premiere of his 15th Symphony at the Philharmonic. I went to that performance expecting another requiem, and instead came quotes from the Rossini and also from Siegfried. So it was so completely bizarre and unexpected, and I, like everyone, I was thinking, what made him compose something like this after the 14th Symphony and everything that was preceding it? And then eventually, one day, I said to myself, well, it's the same thing as it was with Strauss at the end of his life. And at that moment, everything was behind him. And at the same time, everything was ahead of him. And it was in that way that I somehow explained to myself why 15th Symphony came out the way it did. Because everything was behind, but everything was ahead.